Thank you, Deb, and thank you, Mary Lou. I will preface this by saying that I've been a sculptor for 50 years, and this is the first time that I'm speaking specifically on the topic of being a woman sculptor. So I thank you for the opportunity. Let's see. Oh, there were a couple other things here for you, Mary Lou. I guess everybody can see this. You can go download the app for tours, and you can join the conversation. So just to locate all of you, this is the work that is on Wisconsin Avenue. It's near the convention center that was mentioned. I worked with Woodland Pattern to do an interior piece there that included 50 Wisconsin writers. So anyway, here's the piece. And I find this a little comical in some ways that I'm being asked to talk about other women artists. You know, I taught for many years, 34 if you include other places that I taught. And tonight I'm not going to speak as a teacher. I'm no longer a teacher. I loved it, and I see some of my foreign students, and I love you, but I'm on to my studio work full time. So I feel it's very important that in this opportunity to speak as a woman artist that I do take a very clear feminist perspective. And one thing I think in terms of feminism is being transparent and being honest. So Beverly Pepper is an artist that I first encountered her work when I started teaching. And I'll show you some pieces that I used as examples. So she's not a role model for me. But on the other hand, as I looked further into her work for this presentation, I realized that I understand her from a very particular vantage point as a woman artist that has been some of the places that she's been in a different generation than when she did it. And so I will talk about some of those things. I will interject a few of my pieces because there is no such thing as being an objective speaker. And those of you that aren't familiar with my work, the few times that I include it is so that you understand why I'm saying what I'm saying, that I'm saying it from the inside. I'm not saying this as an academic. I'm not saying it as an art historian or a critic. I'm saying it as an artist who understands and has lived the life of a sculptor, and sculpture by women artists have been the most important to me. I always included them in teaching. So I'm going to start with this, which is this actually comes from some of the materials that you can read online for the piece that's on Wisconsin Avenue. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to unpack some of these statements. It's not that they're not true, but they're not terribly complete, which you're not going to have in a short blurb. So the first sentence, like her contemporaries Louise Bourgeois and Louise Nevelson, Pepper forged a unique path as a mid-century feminist artist. In fact, she wasn't a contemporary of either of them. That both Louise Bourgeois and Louise Nevelson were considerably older by 25 years. They came to prominence in the case of Louise Nevelson in the 1960s, in the case of Louise Bourgeois in the later 1970s, mid-1970s, mainly because of the second wave of feminist movement, where people were looking for role models. They were not, Beverly Pepper has made it very clear in her interviews that she enormously respected their work, but they were not role models for her either, and not contemporaries or role models. So we're going to really explore what formed Beverly Pepper's perspective, since it wasn't entirely that. And she worked against the prevailing attitude of women making big, physically demanding art. We will explore that much more thoroughly. And the fact that she learned to weld And this is one place where her life and mine intersected in a very clear way. So I'll talk about that. And while she is not as well known as her American contemporaries due to her living and working abroad, her self-imposed isolation has allowed her to develop a distinctive vocabulary. Well, I'm sorry, self-imposed isolation? I don't think so. You know, and we will explore that as well. All right, so let's start first with influences. We've already put aside Louise Bourgeois and Louise Nevelson, so what can we really look at? Beverly Pepper, like me, and women, and most women sculptors, most, even today, are educated by male artists. When I started teaching, there were 2 other women in this country that were in tenure track positions in sculpture. And there was another one who I didn't realize was Lee Bonteque, who we'll also talk about. So when I show you these slides, I'm going to let you, in a sense, read. Do you see any influence from this male artist, Leger? And she went to Pratt, but she also sought him out as her instructor. Here is a wonderful drawing. This is dated 1953. Pepper was originally educated as a painter, and I would say even today, most women who pursue sculpture start someplace else, like painting. But there's a couple things about this drawing that I think are really significant. This is before she started sculpture. So 2 things I'll point out is this is the kind of drawing a sculptor would do. All you have to do is compare Rodin's drawings with Matisse's drawings, which are simple line drawings of nude women, and you will see the difference between how a sculptor sees and a painter sees in that regard. And so this is a very sculptural drawing. Notice how the paper enters the arm here, that it's just assumed that in our mind we complete it. So this isn't a figure that is like outlined in space. It's one that is in this push and pull with the space that it's in. Even the pieces that are on Wisconsin Avenue, here you have a hole. And the way this bowl is expressed by the dark things, the dark space around it, is a very sculptural kind of strategy. So when I look at this drawing as a sculptor, right away I go, oh yeah, it was just a matter of time before she started working 3-dimensionally. And this piece shows where there is the confusion between, figure and ground, where it enters. This is a piece that is very reflective and kind of dematerializes. So who really was contemporary with Beverly Pepper? Not Lee Krasner. She was an older generation as well, but Lee Krasner was very, very influential in the New York scene. In fact, her teacher, another male, Hans Hofmann, said when he was approached about the fact that he taught Jackson Pollock, he goes, no, Lee Krasner. I taught Lee Krasner. Lee Krasner taught Jackson Pollock. Okay? And if you want to read a really good book, it's called 9th Street Women, and I highly recommend it. But here are Beverly Pepper's true contemporaries: Grace Hartigan, Joan Mitchell, Helen Frankenthaler, and the 2nd generation and 3rd generation of abstract expressionists. So as an artist, as I look at her work, this is what I thought about right away, is to find a context for her thinking. This is a ink on paper piece, and that's the sculpture. But if I go back here a moment, gesture, emotion, direct work. And then it turned into a sculpture like this. And she always did prints, has done prints, and drawings as well. But this now becomes drawing in space. And in 1962, that was a fairly radical idea. That was an idea that she argued and discussed with David Smith, because before that point, most sculpture was mass. And line in space is very hard to read. It wants to become two-dimensional. When you see it like this photograph, of course it's already made two-dimensional, but how do you actually read line in space? It's a very difficult optical question. One of the most important moments in 20th century sculpture was the Spoleto exhibition in Italy. And how this exhibition was formed, there were, what does it say here, 104 sculptures by 53 artists from all over the world. And it was sponsored by the Italian steel industry. And they gave artists opportunities to work in the steel mills to create the sculpture. All 20 that David Smith created there, he created after he arrived in Italy. He didn't ship them over, he made them there, as did all the artists. And that's where Beverly Pepper and David Smith met. And they became lifelong friends. And he was a bit of a mentor to her, but she also really rose to the discourse, and very lively discourse. So I will return to that in a moment. But out of this show, the amphitheater became a recurring theme. And when I say theme, I don't mean theme like content, I mean like spatial theme for Beverly Pepper. And we see it over and over. I'm just going to give you one example, but there are many, many examples of spaces that she's created, land art, that are in that kind of form. Another thing that she's done repeatedly since the Spoleto show is she has put her work in the context of architectural setting, but generally ancient or Renaissance and Gothic kind of settings. And here's another example of work that is on steps. Where the current piece on the Wisconsin Avenue is sited is in front of a building that is in, I can speak to this from the inside because, I was part of it. And that the outside of it is like fake, fake city hall kind of architecture. And then you look, and I like the second photograph where you look across and you see the hotel, which is not terrible, but it's kind of, it's kind of pretty common architecture of the time. And so I find it's really interesting to go from these like historically laden spaces and then to cite her piece here, very conscious, obviously, of the architectural setting. And so I think it's a challenge to us to consider this architecture once again, because remember, this is still ultimately a human gesture. That's what this sculpture is. This shows work that was shown in Rome from her Corten series. And so if I would have cited the work, this is just my opinion, if I would have cited the work, I would have put it where the Barry Flanagan is by the, what is it now? It used to be the First Wisconsin, whatever the bank is. I would have put it there, because I think another thing about this work that is really essential is that you can get around it and you can actually look through it. To look through it where it is, you have to get between a bush and the sculpture to do that. And so I think there are limitations, and this is just me speaking as a sculptor as to what I would have done. And so take it as you want to take it. So prior to Spoleto, Beverly Pepper was doing work with wood on the left. She was living in Italy. When she was invited to be in that exhibition, she was invited on equal terms with David Smith. She was invited because she was a prominent, known sculptor living in Italy and doing work like this. One thing she had never done is she had never welded. And so I'm going to now just take an aside for a moment, because I think an artist who is very much overlooked is one of the most influential artists for me personally. When I was in high school, I didn't know about Beverly Pepper, but a contemporary of hers, Lee Bonteque, and this is the work on the right. And it's also welded. It's also, one of the very groundbreaking aspects of it is she is probably one of the first sculptors, I might say she is the first sculptor that dealt with a concept which was skin, sculpture in skin. So that this is actually belts, fabric belts from, her studio was above a dry cleaner. And so these were the discarded belts. And then she wired them on with copper wire. She sewed them on. And so highly experimental, very non-traditional. I was blown away. As a high school student, I was totally blown away. So I thought I should learn how to weld. And so I went down to the shop in my high school, and they threw me out. And it ended up, my mother went as high as the school board and said, look, I'm paying taxes. She wants to learn to weld. She has as much right to be there as any of the boys have a right to be there. And so they said, okay. And when I walked in, the instructor said, you can use that bench, but I'm not going to teach you. So I taught myself to weld out of a book. And it shows, this is high school work, okay? You know, there are some sculptures here, 16 gauge steel with oxyacetylene, teaching yourself, good luck, you know. But I think you can also see the influence of Lee Bonteque, that kind of swirling and stuff, even though it's physical. Beverly Pepper's experience was similar but different and was on steroids compared to mine, learning how to weld. And I know this because this picture on the right, this is my dad right in here, okay? And my dad headed up the nationalization of the Italian steel industry. I have thank you letters for him from Umberto Eco, and which points out something really crucial about the relationship of industry to art in Italy, as it's different than it is here. Another thing about my dad is when I was born, we lived in a summer cottage with no running water until I was 3 years old. My dad went from that to heading, being president of Kaiser Engineering and Steel International. So I do know firsthand about male ambition. I lived that too. What I love about this particular photograph is, doesn't he look like the spy that came in from the cold? You know, and in a way he was, because a lot of what he did was industrial espionage. And that meant he was away from home, you know, like a month or two at a time. So to go back, we're in Italy, Spoleto, and Beverly Pepper, David Smith, they meet. David Smith doesn't speak Italian. So Beverly Pepper, she's working in one steel plant, he's working in a steel plant in Genoa, and she's going over there translating for him. when I went to Italy, when my dad was working there, women were not allowed in the steel plants, not even secretaries. And actually, I partied with a lot of steel engineers and so forth, but I never was in the steel plant. So one of the things that is amazing to me, of all the artists that were at Spoleto, those 53 artists, she was the only woman, and she learned how to weld in the steel plants there. One reason she was picked, and this comes from an interview with her, was because there was a high rate of labor unions and communists, and she knew how to talk to them. So Corten steel, that's an interesting accomplishment. The fact that she did this is amazing. And really, I am speaking from, I know what that experience is. This was so amazing to me. And she continued. And this is very typical. Beth Sahagian and Chris Andrews are here from Vanguard. This is very typical, that she then was able to work very easily from models into large-scale pieces. But one of the subjects of her work, and I think this comes out of her friendship with David Smith, as you can see, this is made out of tools. David Smith did this piece, and he welded them directly out of tools. But what Beverly Pepper did, which I think is actually harder to do and more interesting, is she actually looked at the tools as an ergonomic object and how its form and shape were very human. Here's a little aside. I was just babysitting for my 2.5-year-old grandson, and we picked up a bunch of sticks, and I have a little video of him scraping 2 sticks against one another, and it just reinforced for me, this human aptitude and ingenuity around tools is a very profound thing. And I think we see it in Beverly Pepper's work, and we have one of these tool-based works. Cleopatra's Wedge is here in Milwaukee, on where Prospect and Farwell come together in Burns Park. I included the Wikipedia entry on it because I don't know, maybe it needs to be updated, but let's see where it is. Barry Mandel, a developer who created the surrounding apartment buildings, has an option to purchase a piece for $225,000. I don't know if he's purchased it or not. And it's been there a long time. But this brings up something else which has to do with Sculpture Milwaukee, which is one of the remarkable things is, you ask an artist to just plunk something like this. Most frequently, the arrangement is they'll pay for you to move the piece there, but they won't pay for you to move it back. So there are plenty of examples, and some of them very wonderful examples of sculpture that's on the Riverwalk that the artist just couldn't afford to bring them back again. And I myself have orphans out in California and stuff that I don't even know if they're even alive anymore. And so Sculpture Milwaukee is doing something right in that regard. So what I really, some of these concepts that I'm going to talk about as a feminist, these inter ones are really tactics that have been employed to exclude women and artists of minority from opportunities. And so what I'm exploring here in expanding on Beverly Pepper is how this operates. So how do we define innovation? And innovation seems to be something in the art world that is highly prized. And very often, if you want to exclude an artist, you just go, oh, their influences were so strong, their work is just derivative. Let's get rid of that. But also in terms of innovative, there is a value placed on being the first to do something. And there's also a value placed on the work itself. When I was coming up in school, if you didn't make it with your own hands, you weren't a good artist. That's changed. We're in a time now which is, why make your own work when you can have Vanguard make it for you? Or other artists, other facilities. But here's a big difference between Louise Nevelson at work and Beverly Pepper at work, which is Beverly Pepper was doing the really heavy work. I love Louise Nevelson's work, but when it comes to actually the work of making the work, she needed a screwdriver and a saw, basically that. And so in some ways, Louise Nevelson got dismissed because you're not using any tools. You're not actually making anything, you're just finding this stuff. But the innovation was that in the way that she found it and made it, of course. I won't belabor that. But Beverly Pepper's innovations and explorations weren't just in sculpture, but the way she brought back the actual real materials to other forms. So this is an etching that is, it looks like it's rusted steel, but it's actually a print from the rusted steel on paper. The fact that she used Corten steel before Richard Serra has become pretty well established. And in my opinion, that's fine, but it's another material. Why don't we say they were the first person to use corian instead of marble? Is that, like really a big claim? I think the reason it's claimed and it's significant for her is because she was dismissed as not being the innovator. And that's the real point there, not the Corten in its own right. And so as, I don't know if she titled this show or if the Marlborough Gallery titled this show, but the title of the show was Corten. So we're looking at, this year, 2019. So part of the marketing, part of the putting forward her significance is being stated up front where it's right in your face. What I would say is more interesting to me than whether she used Corten or not, actually, is other kinds of differences with her and Richard Serra. And this work has always interested me enormously. And because it isn't about making it, it's not about the screwdriver and it's not about the welding torch. In fact, it's not even about joining them together, that they are placed. So it's about gravity, it's about weight, it's about other aspects of the physical world that have been brought into the sculptural lexicon. And that is real innovation. And he did innovate there. So, let Beverly Pepper have her Corten. That's fair. And, other innovators, and, here we have a piece that was in Sculpture Milwaukee as well. Women that have, in the case of Louise Nevelson, that other than, say, Kurt Schwitter's Merzbau, basically you could credit Louise Nevelson with the idea and the exploration in a big scale, in a lasting scale, because the Merzbau was destroyed, of the idea of an environment, not an object, but an environment. With Abakanowitz bringing fibers into the center of the sculptural milieu, rather than as a craft that's someplace else. And then beyond that is bringing them into a bodily relationship, and that's why the figures. So I mentioned periodically I'll put one of my pieces in. So this is an interesting moment for me. So I would really welcome any advice from any of you on this particular thing, which is back in 1999, there was a competition which was called the Millennium Project. And the idea was, this was here in Milwaukee, the idea was that neighborhoods and artists would be joined together. And in fact, they created a meat market that all the neighborhoods had tables along the edge and the artists were thrown in the middle, and it was kind of like being at a middle school dance, you know? You kind of had to meet up. And anyway, Terry Kaufman was president of MIAD at the time, and he goes, "You have to do something for the Third Ward." And so I said, well, you know, the problem with the Third Ward is 794. And so what I propose is something that will make a really human connection between the Third Ward and downtown instead of dividing it like this. And what my proposal was to use chain link fencing, you know, just regular chain link fencing, and to recreate fragments of the buildings that had been removed in order to put the 794 in there, and that they could become places where events could happen and so on and so forth. The reason I'm bringing this up is that just recently in a couple papers, there's some architects that are going, oh, hey, you know, we should do some architecture that's going to connect the Third Ward to downtown because it's a problem. Nobody wants to walk there. I'm going, yeah, 20 years ago, I made that point, and not only did I make that point, but 5 architectural firms in town, 5 of them, invited me to come and present this project to them. It didn't go anyplace because the organizers for the Millennium competition said that the Third Ward wasn't a neighborhood because not enough people lived there. And here's where I would like a little bit of advice, which is, you know, should I bring this up? You know, when I proposed this, it would have cost $50,000. I think we could do this for under $100,000. Should I bring this up, or are all these guys going to just try and gaslight me? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So another one of these strategies is to overlook. You know, I think a lot of women artists will go, oh yeah, how many times have I heard this, which is, oh gee, you know, we should have invited you. Why didn't we think of that? You know, but so maybe ignored is a better term. But to explore this a little further, let's go back to Beverly Pepper. It's about her. You know, and this is one of the first projects that I became familiar with Beverly Pepper. And I first saw this project when I was in graduate school because I got my graduate degree in '79. And so it's land art. It's an earthwork. But what I loved about it, which is really different than some of the people that you know about, like Smithson Spiral Jetty or Michael Heiser Double Negative or Walter DeMaria's Lightning Field, is that people actually live with it and use it and engage with it. And as a feminist artist, to me that is really important. It's not just an expression of massive ego, but it's also a matter of expressing something that's truly human. And so I thought she was really significant. And I don't know the obstacles she faced, but another very important exhibition, and again, this was when I was in graduate school, this is something that really inspired me as an artist, was in King County, Washington. They had all of these sites that were, you know, brownfields and that kind of thing, and invited a bunch of artists, I think there were 10 altogether, to make proposals for land reclamation through art. And here's a couple examples. Mary Miss proposed this is a piece she realized someplace else, but she proposed something on this order, which was these corridors and kind of quasi-architectural structures that were above and below ground. But she also did the river walk. And how many of you know that? Not very many, a few. So when the architectural team got all of their accolades from the American Institute of Architects, their prizes and so forth, and listed all the construction people and so on and so forth, and then, and Mary Miss at the bottom. And yet she hasn't given up on Milwaukee. She's trying to get another project going here. Another artist, Dennis Oppenheim, was doing mainly, at the time of the earthworks, he was mainly doing performative work. So this is in snow, temporary kinds of things. He was invited, but their proposals were hard to see in terms of the photographs, and I don't have any books on it any longer. But he did, this project was included last year. And so that's fine and good, but this is the Me Too moment, which is Dennis Oppenheim on Wisconsin Avenue and Vito Acconci in the Milwaukee Convention Center are both men that were blacklisted by ACAD, the organization of all the art schools in the United States. They were blacklisted against sending interns to them because it was just like sending young women into the jaws of the beast, essentially. And so both Acconci and Oppenheim died before Me Too caught up with them. But there is another artist on Wisconsin that hasn't been caught up with, but it's not my story to tell. But instead of Dennis Oppenheim, the person that influenced Dennis Oppenheim was his wife, Alice Aycock, who was doing plenty of land art and plenty of sculptural works before Dennis Oppenheim was. And I hope maybe someday Sculpture Milwaukee can include one of her pieces, but I know she's really, really in demand and very famous now. But both of these are at Storm King, but this is not unusual, which is this piece was originally done in 1973, back the earthworks thing, but it never found a home until 2010. So we are in a period where, I think we all know this, that people that have been overlooked are being brought in. The only project that was actually realized in King County was this Robert Morris piece. And it's had a lot of environmental problems because he didn't know anything about planting ryegrass and so forth. But I said that particular concept really influenced me. And here's a piece I did in Milwaukee, which is on a landfill at 50th and Valete, and behind it are baseball fields. And so that arbor is based on the swing of a baseball bat. And I'm including it at this point to also say, in terms of overlooked, is that in the art world and in cities, there are certain places you expect to have art and places where, they don't need art over there, and nobody's going to see it. So it's very interesting to me that this was the first project that I did after working on the convention center, which I have a pile of press on that. And on this piece, which was generated by the neighborhood, they came to me with a bag of pennies that they collected from 56 block clubs and said, if you build it, we will come, and once they raised the first $20,000 by doing things like auctioning off a VW, one of the little beetles that was covered with flowers and stuff, and they did all sorts of fundraising things. Once they got the first $20,000, then Harley and a couple banks and so forth were saying, how can we get in on the action of this? And it was in great part built by the neighborhood itself, but it's at 50th and Valide. So nobody took any notice of it in terms of press or anything. But here is Beverly Pepper's proposal for King County. You know, again, it's a landfill, and I think this is a brilliant proposal. The concept is that these pilings are actually where the decomposition of the landfill that would be, you know, like be decomposing, so that as that happens, they would start to do this to reveal what was going on underneath. And over here is a viewing platform. And as I put this, this is just an aside, as I put this together, I realized that out of the 10 artists, 7 of them had viewing platforms. And I'm thinking, that's interesting, because that was part of Alice Aycock's concept on our river walk as well, was to have moments where you could get up and view from there. And this is, you know, another one of those sculptural impulses. But she did realize a piece that has, it's not a landfill, but in form is somewhat similar with a viewing platform. And then here you have another one of her amphitheaters, and this is in Barcelona. An artist who I am continually inspired by, and very few people know her work, is Agnes Dennis. And she has, she's one of the small group of artists that work very closely with scientists, and she makes sure that she really understands the science. So she's kind of like the antithesis of Robert Morris. And most of her work is known through her drawings, because very few of her pieces have actually been built, even though they're all based on really sound science. This one was built. Listen to this: Tree Mountain, a living time capsule, 11,000 trees. Oops, I missed a zero. 11,000 people, 400 years. The trees were planted by 11,000 people. One person per tree planted this. This photograph shows it in 2011. It'll come to fruition in 400 years. So where did she realize this piece? Finland. The only place that I've seen, there are 2 places I've seen her work in person that wasn't just conceptual. And one of them was at Socrates Park. And it's another pyramid, but it's very small by comparison, so you might see it there. Another one of these kind of concepts that is the idea of isolation. And I have to really ask, what does that really mean? This is Beverly Pepper's studio in Todi, Italy, and I'm going, I like this. I like this a lot, you know? Okay. Beverly Pepper with her husband. She was married for 65 years. Can you believe that? Wow, that's amazing. To Curtis Bill Pepper, who was a Newsweek reporter. Okay, how isolated can you be if you're married to a Newsweek reporter? And their children, and this is in the 1960s, or around 1960. So let's compare. Betty Saar, you know, grew up in South Los Angeles at a time where Los Angeles had a very minor, if any, art scene whatsoever. So are you more isolated in South Los Angeles, or are you more isolated in Todi, Italy? So is that an excuse? Is that like a rationale? Is that she was like someplace else? And one of Betty Saar's daughters, Allison Saar, had a piece last year in Sculpture Milwaukee. And she must have been doing something right. Look at these beautiful daughters that are both artists. She could like walk and talk at the same time. She could raise two beautiful children and make art at the same time. So another thing that's brought into question is motivation. Are you, as an artist, are you really committed? You've got these kids. Are you really committed to making art? And Louise Bourgeois, she raised a family. She raised 3 boys. But if you read any of her biographies, or even better, if you read her diaries, what she says basically is, I can hardly wait for them to grow up and get out of here. And oh great, my husband's retired, now I have to deal with that. So she really saw motherhood as an imposition on her studio time. She really didn't come to a wide prominence until after I was out of graduate school. And so she's not an influence on me because I didn't know as much about her as I did about other women artists. But she also makes a point. And feminism is one of those things where it's a club that, you get recruited into whether you want to be in it or not, kind of. And so there was a lot of expectations that she would become a mother figure. And so I think that's, you see with some of the older artists, that they felt like they had enough to do to make art. Why do I have to be everybody's role model? Because there weren't enough role models, and that's why they were being imposed upon. And Louise Nevelson, by comparison, she said, it's a big mistake as a woman artist to have a family. Big mistake, don't do it. And that you'll regret it. And in fact, what has happened, and there's a wonderful new biography on her. And anyway, it solved a certain mystery that I was grappling with, which is the two really, they were cranking out the work, they were showing everywhere, Louise Nevelson, Lee Bonteque. And then all of a sudden, in the 1990s, Louise Nevelson was nowhere. I mean, she was in collections that had already bought her or whatever, but there was no active scene for her work in the art market. And that was because her son, who was very bitter, and her studio assistant were locked in a battle as to what would happen to her legacy. So that's something, there's a few artists in here, we should talk about legacy, but in a way, her son has really impeded on a sharing of a wealth of art by a woman artist, and in part because of the bitterness of being raised in a situation where the mother wasn't as attentive. On the other hand, Beverly Pepper was a mother, and she raised Jory Graham, Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. Amazing. She gets the prize for, you can make art and you can raise a child who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer. And what Jory Graham said is that, she remembers times when Beverly Pepper's studio was just outside the kitchen. I remember times when my studio was a wall in the kitchen. So I think she had it pretty good. She had a studio outside the kitchen. And even though that's true, I created, at that time I was creating a lot of objects and had many shows and created a lot of work off of a wall and a coffee table. They've also collaborated, and this shows just one page from, it's a kind of an accordion book. The poem is by Jory Graham, but this is the outside of a book, and when I found this, I went, oh, God, why didn't I think of that? This book cover is bronze and it looks like mud. And one of the things that's in the description for Sculpture Milwaukee of Beverly Pepper's work is the earthiness of it. that the way she uses materials and why she uses corten is because of the honesty, and it comes from the earth. But it's not just a matter of raising children, it's also a matter of, take for example, I think that Nancy Holt in the sculpture world, she was the wife of Robert Smithson, is kind of like Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock, which is he died and then she is dealing with his legacy, which she did a pretty good job. But she was creating earthworks the same time he was. The Dia Foundation they bought the land and they supplied a living income for the sculptors that did these large-scale remote land projects. Another artist that they supported was Donald Judd. And I've been to Marfa, I would recommend it, it's wonderful and so forth. But it is definitely an expression of a kind of ego that he sued the Dia Foundation when they were on hard times because they weren't paying him the $20,000 a month that they owed him. So Nancy Holt, this piece, all work, it's like your car. It needs to be fixed. It needs to be upkeep on it. And so nobody was upkeeping her work. After she dies, the Holt-Smithson Foundation then donates money to the Dia Art Foundation in order to fix this piece and to maintain it. The art market and opportunities. I think I'll talk a little bit about cultural zeitgeist as compared to fashion as well. We'll start with fashion, but this is also, the notion, we have a lot of mythologizing around who an artist is. And Louise Nevelson knew that. She definitely played it up. But what she said about the feminist movement was, she said, I am grateful for the feminist movement because it really brought me to prominence. Linda Benglis, this is, I'm not there's two photographs that are infamous. The other one was an ad that she placed on the inside cover of Art Forum, but I knew this was being recorded, so I chose this one instead. Anyway, her show announcement for her first one-person show at Paula Cooper Gallery was she was calling the question, is the objectification of women. And her work was not figurative. It wasn't about herself. It was actually, her work is really interesting and innovative at that point in this question of formlessness. It's how can you create work with chance and without predictable form, and that was part of her innovation. In 2017, this is shown as Storm King, but a couple of these pieces were included in Sculpture Milwaukee, and I would have loved to talk about her work. So now I'm taking you back to college. I actually have a college classmate that's here, and to say that I did, this was way before the dinner party, but I did a lot of erotic work, and I'd say my influences were more H.C. Westerman and Eva Hesse at that particular period, that there's latex rubber and fiberglass in it. But I had a period of quite a few years where the subject matter was much more personal. It was much more directly about being a woman. And I think that is always there. You can't not have it there, but it's not as blatant as it used to be. And I think I got this slide out of order. This is a show that I did when I had a wall about this big and a coffee table. So, another thing about the art market is, especially for sculptors, is small works that then can be enlarged into larger works. And I know many, many female artists that have tons of models that are never going to be realized. But in this case, and I think this is a very smart, but it's also speaks to her commitment to real materials and honesty, truth to material kind of aesthetic that she's always promoted, is that these are not models, actually like the models I make, which are out of foam core, you know. These are actually out of the metals and, you know, bronzes and stainless steel and so forth. And so they're, you know, durable small works, but that could be larger. Deb Lowen is in the front row, and I have to say, of all the artists, creative people in Milwaukee, I feel closest to the way she thinks and the way she works, and we've collaborated several times. But I included this mainly because of a kind of cultural zeitgeist. We did this collaboration inside the Wyndham Hall, and the idea of the art of the ordinary was about everyday experience and about being artists, and you can see how many artists were involved in the Midwest. And so what I created sculpturally was a sidewalk which lit up, and then the roof of a typical Milwaukee bungalow that had a lot of projections on it. And so I think it's really interesting, just in terms of zeitgeist, that in this year's show, there is a little holiday house in front of the Milwaukee Art Museum, and I'm going, yeah, great minds think alike. So back to Lee Bonteque. So after many years, she was a really important role model for me, and all of a sudden she disappeared. You didn't see any of her work anywhere, and I mean anywhere. You know, museums own work by women artists, and they keep them in the vaults, and maybe some of them had some of her work, I don't know, but anyway. Then a couple years ago, all of a sudden there was a retrospective. I think it was 3 years ago at the, I saw it at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And here was kind of the rumor on the street was that she had prioritized family over career, which rankled a lot of female artists, even as her triumphant return inspired others. And I thought, this is weird. And then this is what she had said years ago. Because art is art, and it doesn't mean whether it's a woman or a man, it doesn't matter. It's just like another thing to have to fight. And a lot of women artists will say something to that effect, which is making art is hard enough in its own right. And so there was, you know, what happened? You know, where did she go? Now, another artist who has also been in Sculpture Milwaukee that was inspired by her is Kiki Smith, also very much inspired by Louise Bourgeois. And Kiki Smith saw it this way, which is she goes, you know, this is kind of, I was influenced in high school, but you know, I think this is really interesting that she exited from the art world. You know, what does that mean? She kept making work the whole time. But Lee Bonteque, I went down, I saw her talk, and I went up and I asked her. And she said, I don't know why everybody's saying this. I was teaching at Brooklyn College. It's not like I was somewhere remote. If anybody wanted to find me, they could have found me. They didn't find me. That's the truth. They didn't want to find me. And so here's kind of a question. Which of these works, you know, I've shown quite a few works from Sculpture Milwaukee. Which of these works is done by a male artist? Yay, you got it. None of them are. And over 3 years, 22% of the artists have been women. And I'm saying approximately 47.5% have been white men. The ones that I know them that are the older artists that I know, I could say for sure, but I don't know exactly. And so between these two, then there are artists that are of color and of other backgrounds and stuff. So this is a pretty good scorecard, actually. Even though I'm talking about Beverly Pepper, these artists are my generation. This is where I fit in this kind of timeline. And another artist that I'm in the same generation. And this is one of my, I have to say, one of my favorite pieces. I love the sighting of this. I love the fact that it's almost like it's walking down the street next to all these tires and so forth. But I think she makes a point in that, you know, I'm including some of my work so that I'm being truthful about the limits of my perspective. You know, I was raised a white, working class girl who had a father who was really ambitious. So I know kind of both sides of that. It's not the same background, you know, and as other female artists. It's that feminism is a very complex thing. And so I really, in terms of my generation, I had one foot in like the second wave feminism, which is like all for one and one for all, you know, and which was nice, but I have to be honest, I've been screwed over by as many feminists as I have been by chauvinists. So, you know, human nature is kind of human nature. And the other foot in intersectional feminism, which is really important. This is something that I'm working on right now, and another moment of zeitgeist, which is a couple blocks north of downtown. I had been working with plants that I gathered that are what you would consider weeds. Most of them are invasive species. And this piece is about 20 feet long. I actually don't have the money to finish the piece because I just used some cheap window glass. And so it's in progress here. So anyway, I thought this is really interesting because, you know, of the work that's been in Sculpture Milwaukee, I really relate to Booker's work because of the environmental aspect, which is important in my work. And I also, you know, I really like the piece that's in the Chase Bank, you know, in terms of invasive species, but much more beautiful than that. In fact, I went, you know, so it doesn't, you know, it wouldn't go over very well, the idea of like condemned properties just north of downtown and weeds that would be as big as the lobby of Chase, Wisconsin. You know what would happen is that, what's the name of that? Record Milwaukee has been ranking all of the sculptures that have been in Sculpture Milwaukee. So I can see the headline, "Bring the Roundup quick!" I've talked about, you know, influences. So something that women artists hear all the time is, you're too influenced by other things. You know what? Everybody's influenced. Get over it. Innovation, you know, which is, this is an argument that is essentially, ultimately, maybe it's not that important. The fact is that innovation happens and it becomes part of our lives, and that's really important. Is it really a way to sideline female artists by saying, you're not innovative enough? You know, or try this, which is in 34 years of teaching, there's some other teachers here. So you're in a faculty meeting, and at the beginning of the meeting, you raise your hand and you go, I have a great idea, we could do this. And everybody's going, yeah, yeah, yeah. 40 minutes go by, some guy goes, why don't we do blah, blah, blah? And everybody's, yeah, that's a great idea. Well, it was your idea 40 minutes ago, and here's one of the big differences, is that without fail, if it was a woman who 40 minutes later said, I have an idea, remember when she said this, I think we should talk about this more. But when a guy raises their hand and says the same thing, it's like, oh yeah, it's like, yeah, go ahead, credit me with this. And it happens over and over again. And it's something that I never stood for. That didn't happen to me, but I get calls from women in academia frequently that say, how do you deal with this? And I say, be a bitch. That's how you deal with it. Overlooked is really, the real word is ignored. If you can be ignored, isolation, I think isolation, I know a lot of us as artists feel isolated. That's just part of being an artist. It kind of doesn't matter where you live. And that's not a criteria for saying, okay, guess what? Deborah Butterfield, you live in Montana. You can't be doing anything that's relevant. You're isolated. Motivation, I think questioning, commitment and the amount of time that an artist spends. One of the most amazing moments in my life as a woman artist was, let's see, this would be 1980. I called up my gallery in New York and I said, I'm pregnant. And what I was fully expecting was that they would just drop me, because it happened to a lot of women of my generation, that they were just dropped by the gallery. And she said, great, you should have 7. Artists make the best parents. And she represented me for another 10 years. And it was never an issue. So who makes that an issue is the question. And then the art market, there's a lot of reasons, things happen in the art market. For example, galleries, they need to represent work that they really feel that they can sell and help work with the artist to make a career and stuff. So there's a lot of subjectivity in that. But one has to also question, is there systemic priorities? And in the art market, and this isn't something that I'm making up, but generally you can look at the auction prices, but something that I've always done is I walk into a gallery and I look at what an artist is charging. And there's a big difference even today between work, and so many artists women artists have heard, well, I don't want to take you on because I can't sell your work for enough money. The elephant in the room that I'm not talking about at all, but a lot of women artists will hear, is your work isn't good enough. Well, I'm not talking about that, because the other things that I talked about as systemic strategies they're kind of quantifiable, they're kind of concrete by comparison. That quality is a much more nebulous thing. What makes great art is something we continue to argue about. So as I'm wrapping up this talk, what I'm realizing is that Beverly Pepper has a really good strategy, and I think I'll follow this, is live to 94 and keep working. So that's my goal. But I also find it curious, still alive. But also, what we're seeing a lot is, I read the New York Times a lot, so, every day there are things like overlooked but not forgotten, and very often, like 30% of those I go, I knew who that was, why was this overlooked? And so, in a way, I think the moment in which older artists, women artists, and there are very few of them, and that lasted that long and still produced work, are very, very valuable. And I think there will be more of my generation that will live to 94 and be making art. But God, don't come up with this, like it's because you were isolated, or it was because this or whatever, you know, is that you're overlooked but not forgotten. Let's not do that anymore. Okay.